Hi, Farah. Good to see you again.
Hey Tom, great to see you too.
So you're joining us from your home in Philadelphia, is that correct?
That's correct.
Which is one of the three cities you call home?
Yes, but also New York in a way. But yes, Philadelphia, Madrid, and Amman, Jordan, you could consider my homes. And musically, my bandmates are in New York, and I'm more based in New York. A lot of my recordings and other musical adventures that are in the US happen in New York. But yes, I'm here in Philly in my home studio right now.
I,
Happy
I
to
just
be here with you.
and we're happy to have you. And I just wanted to set that up because I think one of the big themes we're going to talk about is your nomadic music and your nomadic lifestyle. And I think the first thing I really want to ask you is how has our current crisis, the COVID-19 and the pandemic and the lockdown, really affected you as someone who travels all over the world to make music?
It's been a challenge, and especially initially it was really hard to adjust to. I'm used to traveling a lot. I have family in Jordan and Spain, and I'm used to flying over, seeing my family, recording, collaborating with different artists around the world. And all of that's come to a halt in terms of being able to be there physically. And my tour has also been, in person, it's been postponed. So that was really challenging. It was heartbreaking. But what's interesting is that I've been able to connect with my fans in a different way using these live streams. And I've been able to perform in real time to my fans all over the world. Like I could be performing to my fans in India, Jordan, Spain, the US, Latin America, all at the same time, and read their comments and all be together, which is very different from, the live experience in person. So there's been some beautiful things that have come out of this musically as well.
All right. And the last time we spoke, you'd also mentioned that you've been working on a new record as well. Has that been held up at all by the pandemic, or is it sort of intensified a little bit?
It's interesting because my band and I were supposed to be finishing up our record in New York, and not being able to physically be in New York and all together with all of this, we've had to do a lot more home recording in our studios. Luckily, we all have our own recording gear and we all have our own home studios set up. So that's been okay, but it's different from, having live recordings because I'm used to recording all of us playing at the same time, not really tracking one over the other. So it's more of a live feel, but we are working with, what we have now, and I think it's going to be great. I'm really excited to share it.
Excellent. And I think we had talked about we were going to kick things off with a song. Is that correct?
Sure. Yes. I have a fun one that I want to perform for you. It's called Digi Ya Rababa. It's from my album Dunya. It's actually the first track on my album Dunya, and the music video was filmed in Sevilla in the south of Spain.
And can you,
And yeah,
real quick, can you just tell us what the title translates as?
yes, Digi Ya Rababa means play the rababa. The rababa is an Arabic instrument. It's very unique sounding, and this is a traditional song. You could consider it a folk song where you say, play the rababa to the rhythm of the lovers who have separated. And, Middle Eastern music, Arabic music in general, doesn't have any of the harmonies that we would see in Western music. But because I've, kind of lived between the two, and musically I go back and forth a lot, and I'm not a traditional Arabic singer, I was able to adapt a lot of Middle Eastern folk music to Western harmony. And so this is an Arabian folk song over a flamenco bass, and added some flamenco, I added some Spanish lyrics as well. So it's fun. Hope you enjoy.
Bravo, bravo. I'm sure everyone else is cheering too. You just can't hear it.
Thank you so much.
Um, so let's talk a little bit about that song, because one thing I love about the video for that, which we didn't show, is that you're beginning to say it was shot in Sevilla, in Spain, in front of the cathedral there, and very close, I think, to the Albaicin Gardens. And what's the significance of that for you as someone who grew up in Jordan, coming to Spain as a teenager?
That's a really great question. So, you know, the Giralda is very, very special to me. Whenever I'm in Sevilla, I literally will go there and just sit. There's a fountain right across from it where I'm sitting playing the guitar.
Right, right.
Well, that fountain is just so important for me. Like, it has so much meaning. I will go there and sit and just face the Giralda. And I usually will be there for as long as I just need to soak it in. And then usually I'll be there around sunset, where all of the birds start flying around the Giralda, around the altar. It's so beautiful. And for me, it's kind of this representation of, you know, Andalusia and the Arab world. And kind of, I identify with that a lot.
Right. I mean, if in the video, it's just literally a visual representation of the historical layers of, you know, Spanish culture on top of Arabic culture, and the two really blending during that Andalus period. And and of course that's the music that you're playing as well. So
right.
It's really, it goes together very well. And, you know, I'd actually like to back you up a little bit and talk about when you were growing up as a kid in Amman, what kind of music you were listening to, and what your musical experiences there was, and then how that sort of changed when you moved to Spain as a teenager, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so growing up in Jordan, I was surrounded by a lot of music. You would be anywhere in a restaurant or a cafe, and there'd be a oud player playing traditional songs. So a lot of the songs that I've recorded that aren't my own originals are actually some of those songs that I grew up listening to, like, you know, Digira Baba, Tala min Beit Abuha, Ya Saad, Ridaha, those songs, which I gave them my own flair, once I recorded them. But, you know, you'd be listening to these folk songs and oud and other instruments. And that was very inspiring for me. But I also was very interested in Western music, and I was very interested in flamenco even before my family and I moved to Spain. And so, you know, it was interesting because in Jordan, a lot of the guitarists start off with, you know, trying to play flamenco inspired music. I wouldn't say flamenco, because often the first, let's say, introduction to what people might think of as flamenco is the Gypsy Kings. At least that's what that was my first taste of like something kind of reminiscent of flamenco, although a lot of flamenco experts will tell you that's not really flamenco. It's kind of very pop flamenco,
yeah.
very.
Catalan rumba tradition, which is a parallel tradition, but it shares some roots.
Right, it's flamenco inspired.
Yes.
And that was my first taste of anything flamenco inspired. And but I also grew up listening to Tracy Chapman and, you know, some American artists as well. And I find that all of that combination of musical influences went into my own sound, you know.
Were your parents big music fans? Did they take you to see music a lot and hear a lot of music in the home?
Yeah, they were, especially my mom and my grandmother. My grandmother would sleep to the radio, to music on the radio. And if the radio wasn't playing, she couldn't sleep. So, she was a very big... Say it again?
Do you remember what she listened to?
She used to listen to a lot of Wadia Safi. And Wadia Safi had an album with a flamenco artist. His name was Jose. And she just loved the combination of the two. And so I would listen to that a lot in her home. My mom loved Whitney Houston, Michael Jackson, Mariah Carey. I loved, you know, flamenco and like Tracy Chapman and Maluma and many different artists. So I had a lot of different influences to absorb.
Right on. And so you're a teenager, a few years later, you come to Spain for the first time. And
my family moves to Spain. And as soon as I got there, I was like, oh my God, I feel so home. You know, it was a very, very strange feeling. I just felt, I felt like I was home. And I started discovering flamenco music, and it just blew me away, and I just couldn't get enough of it. And after my studies at Berklee College of Music, I went to Spain to study flamenco singing. And I wouldn't say that I'm not a traditional flamenco singer. I'm also not a traditional Arabic singer.
Right.
So I kind of have influences of both. But Spain just blew me away, and I later discovered, you know, that part of my ancestry comes from Spain, and I'd mentioned that to you. If you go to Alhambra, there's the Abencerrajes. There was a little, I think it was there was an area that was for the Abencerrajes, which were a family. And there's even a room, the Sala de Abencerrajes, and Aben means like Ibn, it means like son of or tribe of, and es at the end means plural. So if you take those two out, and you only have Terraj, my last name is Siraj. So that was the Spanish pronunciation of Siraj.
So you had some roots there you could refer back to.
Yeah, and it was very inspiring because, you know, I really felt I had some roots. And I was also delighted when it came up in my DNA results. Iberian. I was like, I knew it. But I also felt very strongly like that towards India. And funnily enough, Indian roots showed up in my DNA test.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
You 23andMe and get the
23andMe, it's fascinating. You know, I think everyone should do it. And that would broaden our view of how we see everyone else, I think.
and our connections, I think, would strengthen them quite a bit.
Yeah.
I do want to get to your journeys in India, but I don't want to leave Spain just yet. I have a few more questions for that. One thing I wanted to talk to you about is you mentioned that you, after studying at Berkeley here in the US, you went back to Spain. Where did you study there, and who did you study with?
I studied at the Fundación Cristina Eren in the south of Spain, in Sevilla, and I had Lidia Montero as my vocal instructor. Also, the guitarist Eduardo Rebollar was a huge influence on me, not only musically, but just the outlook of flamenco. And he lived flamenco. He does live flamenco. And funnily enough, he was, you know, he was one of the, you know, I know you can't really talk to Eduardo because he's this really big fish, right? And I just was constantly following him around, like, Eduardo, can you show me this? Eduardo, can you show me that? Now we're like best friends, you know, like we, you know, and that's the thing, that connection is very strong. But Eduardo was a very big influence for me, Eduardo Rebollar. He's in the south of Spain, in Sevilla.
And what other artists inspired you initially once you were in Spain and listening to it on a more frequent basis? Who were the big touchstone artists for you that really moved you and still move you?
And before I forget though, I did also want to mention Calixto Sanchez was one of my vocal coaches, as well as Jose de la Tomasa and Paco Taranto. And, you know, in Spain, and even before, I used to listen to a lot of Paco de Lucia, Camarón de la Isla, a lot of Vicente Amigo. I love how he plays guitar. It's just amazing. And he has very beautiful compositions. Arcángel, Miguel Poveda, of course, Estrella Morente, Jose Morente. A lot of the great flamencos were constantly in my headphones.
Right. And one thing I wanted to bring up is you told me that with your family, you moved originally to Madrid, but then your studies were really in Andalusia. Do you want to talk a little bit about the sort of different cultures of flamenco between the two cities? Like sort of the tablao culture of Madrid and the cafes versus the Sevilla and other points south?
I can't speak to that in terms of so much the flamenco's experience, because they would, a lot of the performers right now would be able to, address that more accurately. But what I would say is a lot of flamenco artists that are in Andalusia also end up moving to Madrid because
Sure.
it's the capital. There's a lot of opportunities. So there's a big culture of flamenco also in Madrid. There's, the more tourist places where you go, you watch a show for an hour. And then there's places like Cafe Berlin where you see different artists, and every Wednesday there's a flamenco jam. And then there's places that nobody knows of, like I was with some flamenco artists, and we all ended up in this underground place where they literally had to bring down the stairs. You couldn't get there if nobody pulled down the stairs. And so there's a whole, it's really fascinating. But Madrid is also a very big cultural hub in Spain, and a lot of flamenco, from Andalusia, and a lot of Andaluces are also in Madrid, and they go back and forth because a lot of flamencos will perform all around Spain and all around Europe and the world in general.
And in the South, how is the culture a little bit different there for performance and where you'll see acts and that sort of thing? How does it differ?
From Madrid?
Yeah.
I think it's less touristy, but there still are a lot of touristic venues. But Andalusia is really where flamenco was born, so you're really in the heart of it when you're there. And you can feel it, there's songs about the azar, about the smell of Sevilla, the soil of Sevilla, of the tierra de Andalucía. Like there's so many different references specific to Andalusia in flamenco music. And that's because it's the hub, literally, it's the core of flamenco.
And do you see more family sort of oriented shows with younger children all the way up to, the patriarchs and matriarchs of the families at those shows? That more than
and it's interesting because flamenco is not just an art and you leave it home. You have generations who have passed down flamenco traditions from the great grandfather or the great grandmother to the grandmother, then the mother, the daughter, the children. Or, so it goes from generation to generation. It's passed down that way. So it's so organic. It's not really something that you just step into and go, I want to pick this up and I want to learn it. And that's part of why, I humbly say that I'm not a flamenco singer. I'm not a traditional flamenco singer. I have influences of flamenco in my music. But, I don't come from a flamenco family, and I didn't grow up listening to flamenco that way. And I feel like a lot of people already carry it in their blood because it's not only a musical tradition, but flamenco has a lot of philosophical elements as well.
Did you find it very welcoming when you began studying? Were the families taking you in pretty?
It was amazing. I really felt home. People in Spain are just generally very, very, very friendly. If you get lost in the street, you might normally here, for example, in the US, you'll just ask for directions, right? And they'll go, when you get there, take a left. And, in Spain, they literally might take your hand and walk you there and go like, it's here, So there's this, and they say that this kind of friendliness comes from the Arab culture, because we also have that in Jordan. People are very friendly. It's part of the culture to be just kind and generous and friendly, and to help people, and to see everyone as your neighbor, as your friend.
Right. And now musically, and not to get too technical, but musically, did you find it easy to connect, for instance, with the palos of flamenco, with the maqams and the modal aspect of Arabic music? Was there a lot of parallels for you that you could tease out?
Absolutely. It's so interesting because, and I've had a lot of these conversations in Spain with flamenco artists, and we'll all say, flamenco, the idea of pure flamenco, it doesn't really exist, because flamenco in itself is a mixture of cultures, from India through the Middle East, North Africa to Andalusia, and a lot of different influences along the way. And coming from the Arab world, I noticed a lot of similarities immediately when I started listening to flamenco. One of them is the introduction of a piece. So In Arabic, you'll have like a mawal where you start improvising. And then after you're done, it could be anywhere from like 1 minute to like 30 minutes. Once you're done, you go into the main piece. Well, you have that as well, not as long, but you have that in flamenco as well, where there's almost always an introduction to the palo, to the piece. And also a lot of similar instruments in terms of oud and guitar. They have a lot of similarities. They have even similar techniques of playing, like using the thumb specifically as you would do with oud. You do that in flamenco guitar. And I noticed, for example, when I first was studying flamenco, I was like, how come they're always saying ole, when you go to an Arabic concert, you'll almost always hear people going, Allah, or yalil, and that is a form of expression that also exists in flamenco. Ole, they say, comes from leil, which means night, and that's very often a word that is improvised in Arabic music. And also they say it could also be from Allah, because a lot of people in the Arab world would say Allah, like how beautiful, it just basically is like, oh my God, so. And flamenco music, in the concerts, people are very expressive. You want to have that ole, and you want to have these gritos from the audience. Otherwise, it's not a good indication. And I remember Paco de Lucia initially had some problems with that when he came and performed for Western audiences. They were used to just, sitting, being quiet, and like that was the form of like respect.
That concert hall experience that we're trained in,
Right, a very different experience. And then you would have some Spaniards who'd probably be shouting "Ole," and then everybody else would be like, what's this about? Why are they creating this? Yeah, how rude. And for artists who are like flamenco artists in particular, that is almost like an energy that you feed off in your concerts. So you want a loud crowd. That's a good indication. So I remember, it's a very different experience. And I remember that Paco Lucia mentioned and referenced that when he was in the US, and I met him, and he was like, they're so quiet. Why are they so quiet? I need them to make some noise. And in contrast, I attended, I think it might have been his last concert before he passed away, may he rest in peace. And it was in Granada, in Alhambra, in the palace. And it was so magical, and people were very, very loud.
You remember what room in the palace? Was it the?
It was outdoors, actually. It was in the main garden.
Lovely.
Yeah.
So we got a lot of ground to cover, and we're going to switch things up a little bit. But I guess the through line is roots of flamenco. One of the other great roots of flamenco is the Romani people that came originally from Rajasthan, eventually made it to Spain, became Gitanos. But you have spent a lot of time in India. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how you first got there. I know you told me you taught at a music school in Tamil Nadu. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So in 2013, I moved to India just briefly for a couple of months to teach at a music academy. And I was teaching at the music academy during the week and touring India and performing concerts during the weekends. And I just fell in love with it, and a lot of beautiful memories came out of that. And it's interesting that you'd mention India as a, in terms of how it relates to flamenco, because I remember just in general, I was playing the music of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. He was, may he rest in peace, a Pakistani Sufi singer. And I played that music for Pitingo, who is a very good friend of mine and flamenco artist from Spain. And he said, that's flamenco. He's singing flamenco, and this was somebody who had no link to Spain. and you could hear it. So you can literally, if you go back tracing the sources, you can hear the flamenco.
Yeah, that ecstatic tradition really transcended the different cultural idioms and still was retained into Spain, into Andalusia.
Right.
But you did more than just tour and teach in India. You recorded a record there that was pretty big. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
It was amazing. So in my last week of teaching and touring in India, I met A.R. Rahman, who is, of course, the world-renowned composer and performer, who has like over 1 billion fans, more than 1 billion fans.
He's a megastar.
Yeah, he is. And so I met him. He had wanted to record my voice in a soundtrack that he was recording in London a couple of years back. But I was kind of given, I think, only 48 hours notice, and I didn't have a visa. So I couldn't make it to the session. So, and I remember flying through London that same day. I was going to Madrid, and I remember very clearly looking at the fire alarm from, I was in Heathrow Airport, and it was the day of the recording, and I didn't have a visa to leave. And I spent a minute just like looking at the fire alarm and going, if I do this, I could just make it and come back. But then I was like, but jail. So I just carried on to Madrid. But when I went back a couple of years later, I told everybody I know, tell them I'm here. So we got to meet. And about 6 weeks later, I was back in Madrid, and I flew to Mumbai, and we recorded for Coke Studio, for Sony Music, Coke Studio, MTV Coke Studio. We recorded a track called Zaria, in which I'm singing the Jordanian folk song Ridaha. And that song hit #1 in India in the charts. And it was just a life-changing experience.
And we have some video of that?
We do.
All right,
if you'd like to see that, I can arrange it. I'm tech savvy now, thanks to WMI. Let's see. All right, let me pull it up. And then I will share screen.
I'll mute myself while you do that.
I should mute myself as well.
Amazing. So much fun. Are you on mute?
I am. I'm unmuted.
Okay, unmuted. Great. One thing I want to do is take a minute out to remind everyone tuned in. If you have any questions, please, we have a Q&A. We'd love to hear from you. We're going to take questions at the end, but you can type them in right now. It'll give us a little time to process them. So anything we talked about so far, anything we're going to talk about coming up, just ask. So go ahead, Farah.
I see a question by John Petchard saying, what made your family make the decision to move to Spain? My dad got a job in Spain, so so we relocated to Spain. And of course, I just fell in love with the country.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
So now we're moving a little bit into your recording career. Why don't we talk a little bit about your first record? And you told me it was a lot.
Yes, it was. My first record of Nomad was a huge production. I don't even know what I was thinking.
Tell us what year that was real quick.
That was in 2011 it was released. Right. And it was, anything that popped into my head that I wanted to record, I just went for it. And it was a huge production. There were 40 musicians, and it was most of them were in Spain, but it was between the recordings themselves took place between Spain, the UK, Jordan, and I believe the US. And the US. And it was just a huge production. But I had amazing musicians. It was a wonderful experience. And if you'll see, the contrast of Dunya is a much more intimate setting with
that was my next question.
Yeah, we were four musicians that went into the studio. Me and my bandmates, we recorded the record, and then we, added instrumentalists later. But it was a much smaller production, and it was kind of the polar opposite of Nomad.
One thing, and I don't want to embarrass you, but for Nomad, you had 3 continents, 40 musicians, and you were producing and writing the whole record. At what age? What
age was I? Let me see. It was 2011. I think I was 26, 27.
Amazing.
I'm horrible with maths. Ask my dad, he'll confirm.
But just to accomplish that much and produce it and write it and record it, that's impressive. So hats off.
It was an amazing project, and I had a good team. I mean, I was in Sevilla, and I also had a lot of inspiration there. Incredible musicians who lived, breathed music, and of course, like in my home country as well, I had wonderful musicians, and it was generally just a beautiful, beautiful project.
Right, and so for your second record, which was called
Dunya.
The musicians you used on that, are they the same ones you generally tour with now?
So on that record, we have Andreas Arnold, who's an incredible artist in his own right. And he's still my bandmate and musical director. We play together so beautifully. We're family at this point. And of course, we also have Marcelo Walowski on percussion, I think 2 or 3-time Grammy Award winner. He also tours with Snarky Puppy, and Andrzej Strotmistrovski on bass, and then other invited artists who collaborate as well. Amir.
That's the nucleus.
Say it again?
That's the nucleus, those musicians?
Yes. Yeah. And I also, and now, I also play with Jeremy Smith on percussion and Adam Malouf. And I like to collaborate with a lot of artists as well. I feel like that's a fun thing to do, and you grow musically. And I've had the pleasure of, collaborating with artists from all over the world, including in Spain with Pitingo, with Dorantes, and other incredible flamenco artists.
And do you find that your shows change a bit depending on what countries you're performing in or what areas you're performing in, or is it pretty much the same show?
No, it's never the same show. That's the thing. It's never the same show. So first, I love the thing I most love in the world is performing to a live audience. That's just, I mean, that's where I'm home, you know, more than anywhere. So first of all, I'm really itching to get back on stage and perform for my audience and you know, perform for people in person. Um, but the performances are always different. There's a lot of elements of improvisation, and so that's, you never know what's going to come out. And Andreas and I in particular tend to have a lot of fun with improvisation, because I'll just go off a different track and I'll just look at him and be like, are you following? And he'll be like, yes, I'm following. And then, you know, we'll just take it somewhere completely different. And I love that I can do that, just decide in this, you know, spur of the moment that, nope, we're going to go somewhere else. So there's a lot of elements of improvisation, but also depending on the audience, you know, our performances are different. And sometimes when I'm abroad, sometimes I'll play with local artists there and local musicians, and that changes the sound completely, because each person brings their own experience, their own musical influences into the music. So it's almost never the same.
Very cool. So we're starting to get some questions in, and one seems very pertinent to what we're talking about. So I'm just going to go ahead and take that. Anonymous attendee tells us, so glad you love India and Spain. Question is, how could you combine Spanish and Indian music style with original Arabic music? That's a pretty good question.
That's a great question. I think that's, you know, I think it doesn't have to be calculated or forced. Indian, Spanish, flamenco in particular, and Arabic music have a lot of threads in common that you can really, you can just tie them together in a beautiful way. I have a song, Hey Ke Dunya, on my album Dunya, which has a very Indian feel, even though I didn't realize as I was writing it that it has an Indian feel. But people have told me, you know, this sounds really like it has an Indian influence. And the more I listen, the more I realize, yeah, I think it does. You can tell me.
You know, one thing we didn't talk about is, who are your favorite Arabic singers and artists? Who are the ones that really influenced you on that end of things?
So I love Zafar Youssef. He's a Tunisian oud player and vocalist and composer, and he's just amazing. I listen to his music for the longest time, and sometimes I'll just meditate to it because it has that power over, you know, my emotional state. I also love Saad Masi. She's incredible. I listened to a lot of Maluma growing up. She's a Mauritanian artist that sings in Arabic, and her, you know, her way of performing is just stunning. And then, of course, you know, growing up, I heard some Kulthum, Fairuz, and then, you know, a lot of the traditional artists. But I was more drawn towards singer-songwriters and more contemporary Arabic music and Arab artists, I'd say.
And I want to talk a little bit about, you are a cultural ambassadress from Jordan.
So it's interesting because being from Jordan and performing a lot, I get to represent my country in so many ways, musically, but also as a person. You know, sometimes people have never met a Jordanian, and I get to make the first impression. And I go, well, I could make or break this right now for the whole country, possibly. You know, it's really interesting. Say it again.
It's a lot of pressure.
It is. And, you know, what's interesting is, you know, a lot of people in especially in the US may have never seen where I perform. You know, I'll tour a lot in the US, and I'll go to certain areas that are not as metropolitan or sometimes not as international. And what's interesting is that sometimes people will have never seen a female Arab Muslim artist before. And, you know, through that musical dialogue and that experience, you know, we're able to transcend those boundaries or perceptions, preconceived perceptions, and hopefully break some stereotypes, because it's it's really interesting, like particularly being an Arab Muslim woman, there's a lot of stereotypes out there about, you know, what people think I might be, or, you know, women in general might be. And, you know, it's interesting to see that break down right in front of your eyes.
In real time.
Yeah.
So, and I'm just curious, can you sort of share with us how one becomes a cultural ambassadress? Like how were you approached?
That's interesting. Well, I think because of a lot of my engagement for peace and a lot of my involvement in humanitarian causes through music, and we've talked about that, you know, and also being abroad and performing abroad a lot. There's not a lot of Jordanian artists in general that are outside of Jordan, so it's an opportunity for me to represent my country and my culture in many ways. But we had talked about music being a medium for raising awareness about humanitarian causes, and I do want to touch on that.
Yes, and that was my next question. You've anticipated that. You see where I'm going with this. Well, let's just jump into it. Let's talk a little bit about your work with the UN. You work in, I'm sorry, it was Sudan, and also your advocacy for things today. But tell me how you first got involved.
So growing up in Jordan, you know, conflict was kind of always around the corner. And I would see, you know, I grew up with a lot of friends that were Palestinian and had, you know, their parents were Palestinian refugees or came from families of, that were refugees. And also, you know, with the Gulf War, Jordan experienced firsthand what it's like to see people fleeing violence. And so growing up there, I got to have a lot of conversations and got to see the actual effects that war and violence has on people. And so seeing that, that came out in my music. You know, it was not possible to separate. I heard a lot of stories. I even remember, you know, during certain times at the Gulf War, we had to put some, what's the word, tape on our windows, so in case a bomb fell by accident, you know, the windows wouldn't crash, although, you know, and things like that. So there was, Jordan is very, very, you know, there's a lot of peace in Jordan in that sense, like, you know, but conflict was kind of always around the corner in our neighboring countries. And so, and a lot, yeah. And so I wanted to use my music, even though initially it was unconscious. I was writing about the effects of war, violence, occupation, and invasion through my music. And then I became more and more aware of the impact that music can have on spreading a message of peace. And I remember in particular, I wrote, when I was a student at Berkeley, I wrote a song about the women of Darfur in Sudan. And I wrote that song, it's called Lennan Saki, or in English, To the Sudanese Women, that's the title. I'm re-recording that song actually. It'll be on my next album, like 15 years later. So, and it'll be, you know, just as great, hopefully, and maybe even better. But the point is, that song was taken to the refugee camps, and since it was in Arabic, the women could understand it. And actually the song was to the Sudanese women of Darfur in particular, saying, we've not forgotten you, we've not forgotten your rights or your children's rights, and we've not forgotten your suffering. And it was a very eye-opening moment for me, because the women in the camps, when they heard that song, got up and had a response. They were singing and clapping, and that response was recorded, and I got to hear it. And other composers have based compositions on that reaction, and that's where I realized the power of music. And it was played before the United Nations Security Council before passing a legislation to call it a genocide. And so for me, that was a very impactful moment for me to realize the power of music and how, you know, you can use your voice for something
And Farah,
that matters.
were you still a student at Berkeley when they played that before the Security Council?
Yeah, yeah, I was. Yeah, I was. And in Boston, I see someone asked about Boston. You know, I was kind of campaigning a lot in my student years to end the genocide in Darfur. And so I was performing a lot. You know, sometimes I'd get a call from the mayor's office. Can you come? We have this rally. We need you here. Or like different activists would call me. And I just come and perform. And often, sometimes it would be for a talk or a presentation about the you know, about the genocide, and people would be listening, and you know, they would be getting the information, but then, you know, they'd ask me to perform, and I would perform that song. And the music in general has this power to touch you on an emotional level. So though people were getting the information, when the music started, I'd see them tearing. And then, you know, the organizers would come to me and say, you know, the message arrived, you know. So that was a big honor for me. And again, it just showed me how important music can be in trying to amplify voices of people who need to be heard.
And one thing I'm personally curious about is how important was it, sort of the optics of having an Arabic voice singing on behalf of the people of Darfur, of the people in Darfur?
Well, what was great is that my song didn't need translation because they spoke Arabic and they understood it. Had I, you know, sang it in another language, it wouldn't have translated the same. And I feel, you know, music in general can, you sometimes you don't need to understand the lyrics, but in that specific scenario, I was literally singing to these women saying, we've not forgotten you. And because they were able to understand all the lyrics, they understood the message. And they told the activists that were there in the camps, they said, you know, we didn't know that people on the outside knew about our situation, and now we know, you know. Because of course, how are they going to know? No one was acting, and they didn't have internet. They didn't have, you know, so they didn't know. And and so that response, the musical response that they sent back, I got to hear, and I was in tears and really moved by it.
That's so cool. But one thing that you told me is that your activism is with your refugee activism is still ongoing, even now in Philadelphia. Do you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I mentioned, my music is very much involved in humanitarian causes, human rights, animal rights, and of course, refugee rights, right? So me being here in Philadelphia and, you know, being fluent in English and Arabic, there's been a lot of, you know, need for volunteers to help refugees from Arab countries, specifically Syria and Iraq. Less now because they're not being granted asylum or refugee status. But I, you know, found that in my own time, I was able to volunteer helping them as a translator, but also small things like, you know, they might need to have surgery and they need someone to be translating between them and the surgeon so they know what's going to happen. And unfortunately, the reality of refugees that are resettled here, we'd like to think it's a, you know, success story where everything is solved, but truth is that the vast majority of them are resettled into poverty. So it's a very sad scenario, and their only hope really is for their children to have a better future.
And when you say resettled into poverty, can you break that down a little bit and explain that, what like the daily that means for people?
Sure. So a lot of people who might have degrees, they're not valid here. So somebody who might be a doctor might end up being an Uber driver. Somebody who had their own shop might end up being a janitor. So, and they are not, you know, they're not really given the financial opportunities or even the financial support that they really should be getting. I believe personally. And here in Philadelphia, unfortunately, a lot of the refugees that arrived were, kind of put in neighborhoods that were secluded from the rest of Philadelphians. So that I feel was a way of kind of keeping them hidden, and I don't feel that's okay or fair, So there's a lot of experiences that are not talked about and not seen, because how would we know, right? But I think it's important to highlight.
Absolutely. And I'm just curious, how has that community been faring during the COVID crisis? Have you been in touch with them? Has been able to help at all?
Yeah, it's been difficult because, trying to manage a new country, new language, new experience, then with quarantine and a pandemic, is challenging. I know some who have lost their jobs and are trying to find a way to support their families. So yeah, it's challenging. I mean, imagine how, many of us who already had our life sorted out before COVID. Well, imagine being a refugee and then adding COVID on top of that. It's really daunting.
And are there any organizations or websites you can refer people to who might want to help?
There's many different organizations. I have worked with the Nationality Services Center, and there's different organizations, but I think depending on what you'd like to support, you can find. But in general, I feel like we need to be supporting more. Yeah. And I even thought about starting my own organization because a lot of times they have to choose between getting a job and paying the rent or taking English classes. And so a lot of them don't end up really being able to grasp English language the way that they would want to, not because they don't want to, but because they have to work. And so I thought about having a program where we have volunteers who will take an hour or so a week to speak in conversation with a refugee and help them with their English, because they can take some grammar, but then when it comes to speaking, that's a very different thing. Yeah.
And especially with that Philly accent. I mean, that's... So we talked a little bit about your song for the refugees in Darfur. Do we want to play that?
I don't actually have Oh, do you see me? I don't actually have the recording of that one just yet, or the instrumental version, but I do have one that I've been wanting to perform for you. It's called Déjame Entrar. It's a combination, because we've been talking about flamenco and Arabic influences. This is a song that's on my album Nomad that is a kind of like a combination of an Arabian folk tune with a flamenco tangos palo and my own composition in the middle. So if you'd like, I can perform that one for you.
Just before, I want to remind people, if they have any more questions, please let us know. We're going to take questions very soon after this, I think. So.
That sounds great. All right.
Hear it.
Shall I take it away?
Yeah, take it away.
Okay. Déjame entrar, déjame entrar, déjame entrar en tu mente algún día. Déjame ver, déjame ver, déjame ver a través de tus ojos. Sé que encontraré algo tan bueno, tan bello, tan dulce, tan precioso. Pero tienes que abrir Tom, you're muted.
Hello. Tom, you're muted.
It's back, but I'm going to throw it to you anyway, Gabby. Thank you so much, Farah, but we're running out of time. I'm going to throw it over to Gabby.
Thank you so much, Tom.
No, we want to, thank both of you for this great conversation. We're sorry we went a little bit over, and we thank you though for coming, and we hope it's definitely been worth your while, and we look forward to seeing you again at the next WMI Plus at home. We look forward also to sending you the email with all the various links and the information that Brian also had shared in the chat. We will also include information on where and how the song about Darfur can be found and listened to. And again, thank you so much for joining us and for being a part of our community. Have a good evening, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.